Hello and welcome back to another Age of Sigmar painting tutorial. In this video I'll be showing you how you can paint the Tenebrel Shard from Warhammer Quest Silver Tower, and I'll be using the Citadel range of paints to do so. So here we have the Tenebrel Shard that I'll be painting as part of this tutorial. Now you may notice that I've also kept a couple of the arms and the cloak of skin at the back there. I've kept those separate, as you can see here, so it just makes painting in these recesses much easier. Now as you can see, I've primed using the Army Paint as a uniform grey spray primer because I find that grey acts as an excellent base for these lighter miniatures. Now the first step in painting this miniature is to paint these inside sections of cloth, just as you can see on the legs there. We're painting these first of all with Stegodon Scale Green. Now the reason we're painting these areas first is because it's generally speaking better to paint from the inside out, and as these are inside the actual trousers or the pants for my American viewers, it's a lot easier to paint them, and if you overspill it doesn't matter because we can clean that up at a later step. So as you can see, this Stegodon Scale Green is covering really nicely over the grey, and this is because it's a base paint, so the pigmentation levels are a little bit higher. It makes painting the first layer much easier. Once you've completed the base layer of Stegodon Scale Green, the next step is to wash over it using Nuln Oil. The reason for applying this wash is because we want to darken the colour of the Stegodon Scale Green. It's a little bit too light for what we want at the moment, but also, as you can see here, it's actually pulling into the recesses and just improving the shading there as well. Once the Nuln Oil is dried, the next step is to apply a highlight in the inside of these blue areas here, and we're going to be focusing this along these top sections here around the top edge, and for this we'll be using Thunderhawk Blue. So with just a small amount of paint on my brush here, and I would recommend using a small brush as it makes highlighting much more easier, we're going to be focusing along this inside top edge here. We're painting on the inside of the actual trousers here, just a very fine line. So I'm just being very careful in this application. I'm not rushing into applying it. I'm just following the curve around this top edge here. I'll be doing this across all of these inside sections. With the first highlight completed, we'll now be performing a second thinner highlight just on top of the first one using Fenrisian Grey. So I will be applying this highlight in a similar way to the previous step. I've got a very small amount of paint on my brush. I'll be focusing this on the top semicircle of the highlight that we've already got. So just putting a small line of Fenrisian Grey in there like so. I'll be doing this on all of the highlights that we performed on the previous step. The next step in painting this miniature is to paint all the black areas. This includes the trousers there, also the hair, the elbow guards just on the armour, and also in the hand as well. And we're painting all of these areas with Abaddon Black. When applying the Abaddon Black, one thing you need to be careful of is not overspilling onto some of the other areas such as the skin. Even though we haven't painted over them yet, it's a lot more difficult to paint over black than it is to paint over the grey, so just try and be as neat as possible and keep the black on the black areas of the miniature. Once the layer of Abaddon Black has been completed, the next step is to highlight all the folds in the material and also along the hair as well. And for this, we'll be using Eshin Grey. To highlight the hair, we're going to be dragging our brush parallel to the surface of the hair, and this will pick out all of the individual strands like so. You can see I'm just running the brush gently along the edge. When we actually come to highlight the other areas, such as the trousers, we're doing this a little bit differently. So we're applying it similar to how we did when we applied the highlights to the blue material. Let's be picking out the edges like so, very carefully applying the Eshin Grey, and then same with these folds around the knee as well. Once the first highlight is completed, we can now perform a second highlight on the black areas, this time using Dawnstone. Again, we'll be painting the hair and the cloth in two slightly different ways. For the hair, we'll be focusing our efforts mainly on the tips of the hair strands, as you can just see I'm doing on this flick here. And then we actually come to paint the cloth. We're actually going to be painting this in a sort of similar way to we painted the blue areas, just focusing on a small section of the arcs above these circles like so, and then when we come to paint the knees, we want to focus on the corners. It's pretty much anywhere you would imagine it's more raised than anywhere else, and where the light is hitting it from above. Now that we've completed the highlights on the black areas of the miniatures, the next step is to paint all of the skin areas and also this inner section of hair just in this large mane here. We're painting all of these areas with Celestra Grey. For this step, unless you're using a wet palette, I would recommend mixing in a small amount of water. Whilst it's a base paint, it covers much more smoothly when it's a little bit watered down. So I'm just covering all of the bare skin areas on the feet, the chest, the face, and also the arms as well. Now, in addition to that, I'll also be painting the middle streak that runs down the center of the hair. So there's going to be a few of these sections of hair just on the center here. Now I'd recommend taking a look at the studio painted miniature for exactly which strands to paint, as there are a few specific ones, but generally speaking it's going to be the ones in the center and more towards the end. With the base layer completed, the next step is to continue working on the hair here. So first of all, we'll be washing over the Celestial Grey base coat with a very watered down wash of Drakenhof Nightshade. I've mixed together roughly 2 parts water to 1 part Drakenhof Nightshade. It's because when I apply it over these grey areas here, I just want it to pool into the recesses and not dye the actual colour of the Celestial Grey. You can make it too blue, we just want a very subtle blue in the recesses, as you can see I'm achieving here. With the wash dried, we can now continue by applying some highlights on the very tips of the lighter hair colour at the back here, and for this we'll be using White Scar. In order to avoid the white being too overpowering for this highlight, I've mixed in roughly 2 parts White Scar to 1 part Lahmian Medium, and this just thins it down enough. As you can see here, if I just apply it to the very tips, it's not incredibly strong, it just creates a really nice subtle highlight. I'm just blending it ever so slightly as I run down the hair. With the hair completed, we can now move on to painting the skin areas, and first of all we want to give the skin a little bit more of a natural skin colour to it. So for this we'll be using a wash of Reikland Flesh Shade. As with the Drakenhof Nightshade wash that I applied to the hair, I've severely diluted this wash as I don't want to be too overpowering. I still want to maintain that really pallid skin colour. As you can see here, it's applying a very subtle skin tone to the flesh there. But it's not too bright, it still looks quite pallid. Just making sure this pulls into all of the recesses here. With the wash dried, the next step is to start applying a glaze across the skin, and for this we'll be using a mixture of pallid witch flesh and Lahmian Medium. A mixture of 1 part Lahmian Medium to 1 part pallid witch flesh should be sufficient for this step, and what we want to do is we want to focus our attentions on the main blocks of the body. We want to leave the darker sections still visible in the recess. As you can see, I'm just picking out the individual ribs here. The reason why we mix in the pallid witch flesh with the Lahmian Medium is because we don't want it to be too strong. We want a very, very subtle blend between the two, because skin is very rarely very sharp to blend into other colours. For the next step, we'll now be concentrating our efforts on the red areas. This includes the belt, the chest, and also the headgear, just that we've got at the top here. I'm painting the insides of all these areas with Khorne Red. Unless you're using a wet palette, I would recommend mixing in a small amount of water with the Khorne Red, just to make the application that much more easier on the inside of these panels. With the base layer for the red areas completed, the next step is to wash over it using Nuln Oil. By washing over the red areas with the Nuln Oil, we not only darken the colour of the red considerably, which gives a much deeper colour that we want, it also pulls into the recesses and just applies some nice shading in there. Once the wash is dry, we can now start brightening up the red areas a little bit, and for this we'll be using Evil Sunz Scarlet. So using the Evil Sunz Scarlet, I'll just be picking out the central areas of these panels here, leaving the darker red visible in the recesses still. As you can see, I'm just being careful just to apply it very carefully over the red areas like so. The next step in painting this miniature is to paint all the flayed flesh. This is this strands here, and also I'll just bring in the rest of the cape here, and including this small skull as well. We're painting all of these areas with Rakarth flesh. For this step, it's just a case of applying the Rakarth flesh over the entirety of these skin areas. If you're not using a wet palette, do mix in a small amount of water just to improve the coverage slightly, so you're not painting with undiluted paint, and just making sure I get into all of these areas, as you can see I'm doing here. With the base layer of Rakarth flesh completed, the next step is to wash over these flayed skin strips using Reikland Flesh Shade. If you're not using a wet palette for this step, I would recommend mixing in some water into the wash, as you don't want to be too strong. We want to maintain this pale colour of the skin. You see, I'm just making sure it covers the entirety of the surface, and it pulls into all of these little recesses here. When the wash is dry, you can now apply a highlight to the skin areas, and for this we'll be using Kislev flesh. As with previous highlights, this step will involve me picking out the edges of this flayed skin. I'm just dragging my brush along the edge like so, picking out this fold here. Recommend using a small brush for this, as it is a lot easier to drag it along these edges. You've got a lot more control over it as well. You can see I'm just making sure I get all of these edges here. So the next step is to paint the stitching and also the skulls across the miniature. Now they would have been base coated with the Rakarth flesh at the same time, so I'd recommend next step is to wash over the stitching, first of all, with Seraphim Sepia. For the stitching, we just want to be very precise in our application of this wash. We want to make sure it pools around the stitching like so. This kind of really makes it stand out and also creates a slightly darker skin tone just where the seams are. And when you're actually washing over the bone areas, I would recommend a solid wash over the top. When the wash is dried, the next step is to pick out all of the individual stitches and also to highlight the skull. And for this, we'll be using a Shabti bone. You will want to use a thin detail brush for this step, as some of these areas are quite thin. And we just want to lightly pick out the individual stitching. You can see I'm not applying too much pressure here, just very lightly dragging the brush across the surface, which creates this nice highlight. The next step is to paint these tendrils emanating from the ground here, and I'll be basing these with Naggaroth Night. Naggaroth Night gives us a really nice base layer on which to work from, this really deep purple colour. You can see I'm just making sure that it gets across the entirety of the tendril here, making sure it doesn't overspill onto the feet that we've already painted as well. Just be very careful around here. Take it steady, you don't need to apply it really quickly. Just making sure I get it everywhere. With the base coat completed, the next step is to apply a highlight over the tentacles using a mixture of Genestealer Purple and Lahmian Medium. Mixing in the Lahmian Medium will really thin down this mixture. As you can see when I apply it here, it's not applying very thickly, it's just applying a very subtly lighter shade. And I'm focusing on the top section here, and if you want to imagine a light source coming down from above, it'll be focusing mainly along the top edge. And then once this is done, we can apply a second coat, allowing the first coat to dry thoroughly first, and this will create a nice blending between the lighter purple and the darker base colour as well. When the Genestealer Purple is dry, the next step is to apply a second highlight over these tentacles, and this time we'll be focusing on the thorns and also the small boils as well. For this, we'll be using Decalia Lilac. If you're not using a wet palette, I would recommend mixing in just a small amount of water here. We want to focus this on these spines, just picking them out very carefully with the Decalia Lilac. And we're going to apply a small amount on the tip here of the tentacle, and then as you can see here's a small boil. I'm just going to pick that out as well. Before we move on to the metallic areas of the miniature, there is one optional step you can take, and this is to add some blood splatters to the flayed skin. And for this, I'll be using Blood for the Blood God. Blood for the Blood God is an excellent paint for representing blood because it dries shiny and clear, so it's really good for fresh blood. So you can see here I'm just dabbing it on, like so, creating like blood splatters. And generally speaking, with this kind of thing, less is more. If you apply too much, it just looks far too grotesque and kind of overpowers the miniature a little bit. So I'm just going to be applying small specks across the skin. With all of the matte areas completed, we can now move on to painting the metallics. And first of all, we'll be focusing on the gold trim on the headdress, the armour on the arm there as well, any crescent moons across the miniature, and also the trim along the chest and the waist as well. And for this, we'll be using Balthazar Gold. With the Balthazar Gold, I'll be applying this across the entirety of these trims that we've got here, and then also on the panels on the armour on both arms. Pretty much everywhere there isn't a blade, such as these on the forearms, the fingers, and also the legs as well. With the first layer of Balthazar Gold completed, the next step is to wash over it using Seraphim Sepia. The reason I'm using Seraphim Sepia instead of Agrax Earthshade for this wash is because it's not quite as dark as Agrax Earthshade, so it creates some nice shading in the recesses without darkening the gold colour too much. Before we highlight the gold areas, the next step is to base coat all of the silver metal areas. This includes the blades here and also the blades on the leg, and we're painting these areas with Ironbreaker. The reason I've chosen Ironbreaker over Lead Belcher is because it's a lot brighter and I want to have this nice bright silver effect. However, because it isn't a base paint, you may need to apply 2 thin down layers as opposed to 1 neat layer out of the pot. So I've just mixed in a small amount of water here. If you're using a wet palette, you don't need to mix in quite as much. And I'm going to apply 2 layers, applying the second once the first layer has dried thoroughly. With the Ironbreaker base layer applied, the next step is to wash over all of the silver metallic areas with Nuln Oil. Even though I'm going for quite a bright silver effect on these silver areas, I still want to apply a wash because this will create depth in the recesses, and it'll also really enhance the edges when I come to highlight them in the next step. Once the Nuln Oil wash is dried, the next step is to highlight across all of the metallic areas. This includes the gold trims that we painted in the previous steps and also the silver areas as well. I'll be highlighting all of these areas with Stormhost Silver, but you could use Runefang Steel instead. As with previous highlights, which are going to be focusing this along the edges, as you can see here, I'm just being careful to drag the silver just on these upper tips there. It's almost as if the light is coming down from above and it's just reflecting off these edges here. The reason I'm using Stormhost Silver instead of a Runefang Steel is because it's ever so slightly brighter and I want this really nice bright effect, but you could use Runefang Steel if you did wish to. One of the final areas to paint on this miniature is the gem just on the chest there and also around the waist as well. And the reason why I've left it until after the metallics to paint is because it's a lot easier to paint the metallics first and then the gem over the top instead of the other way around. Now the first task in painting these is to apply a base layer of Sotek Green. After painting the metallic areas, I would recommend thoroughly washing your brush and also cleaning out the water you're using, as you don't want to get small metal flakes into this paint here. And as you can see, I'm just sort of making this base coat apply across the entirety of the gems. Once the base layer has been applied, we're now going to be highlighting the edges of the gems using Temple Guard Blue. Using a detail brush, you just want to pick out the raised sections. We can see we've got this quite hard edge along the top of the gem here, and also there should be 4 of them on each one. I'm just picking those out with the Temple Guard Blue like so. With the highlight completed, the next step is to apply some shading by applying a wash of Drakenhof Nightshade. By applying a small amount of Drakenhof Nightshade wash over these crystals, it will pool into the faces of the crystal and this creates some really nice depth, which you can see I'm just doing here. Just applying a small amount, you don't want to apply too much, you don't want to overspill onto the metallic areas either. One of the final steps in painting this miniature is to apply a small dot of white scar onto the gems, and if you're feeling adventurous you could also paint the teeth with the white scar as well. With the white scar I'm just going to be applying a small dot just above the tip, so if you can see here we've got this gem here, I'm just going to be applying it above the tip like so. Let's just create a nice reflective glow on the surface, and I'll be doing the same on the chest as well. Now if you do decide to paint the teeth, make sure you use a very small brush as the teeth are quite fine. And here we have the completed miniature who I've assembled and placed on a base. You can find out how I base this and my other Silver Tower miniatures in my Silver Tower basing tutorial. If you enjoyed this video, do let me know in the comments below, and you can also vote on which miniature from Silver Tower you would wish me to tackle next by clicking on the small eye in the top right corner of the video and voting for your favourite. If you would like to support me in making more tutorials, you can do so by heading on over to my Patreon page, which you can find a link to on the screen now. From there you'll be able to donate to me from as little as $1 a month, which will really help me in making future videos. If you would like to be kept up to date with all the videos and projects that I'm working on, you can do so by subscribing to this channel or heading over to my Facebook or Instagram pages, which you can find a link to in the description below, along with a list of paints that I've used in this tutorial. So until next time, thanks for watching and goodbye.